Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. My guest today is George Nickas. George Nickas is the executive director of the environmental organization Wilderness Watch, headquartered in Missoula, Montana. The focus of this organization is the preservation and proper care of America's wilderness preservation system, which now includes about 112 million acres. George and those who work with him have undertaken the enormous task of preventing diminishment and loss of wilderness values. Wilderness Watch is focused on keeping wilderness wild. Welcome, George.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to spending some time with you and your listeners.
Would you like to make some introductory comments? Then I will ask you some questions.
Well, I appreciated what you had to say. And yes, Wilderness Watch is the only national organization which is solely focused on making sure that this wonderful national wilderness preservation system that Congress has set aside is protected and managed to preserve its wilderness character forever. And it is a challenge, as you note, becoming more so all the time. But it's always been a big challenge because the whole idea of wilderness, which is basically that we are going to allow nature to operate without human interference and human intervention, and allow these places to be wild and allow their native inhabitants to be wild. That kind of runs counter to a culture that has been focused on transforming wild nature into something that is perceived as having immediate human benefit. So, the whole idea of letting places be wild was a challenging concept back in the 1950s and 60s when the Wilderness Bill was being debated and ultimately passed by Congress, and it's still a challenge. So, anyway, that's what we're focused on, and hopefully we'll be successful.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. My first question concerns the well-known dilemma of wilderness being loved to death, simply as a result of more and more people gaining awareness of its values, but also because human population growth is putting more and more stress and strain on our wilderness areas. Don't these realities necessitate that keeping wilderness wild requires both a lot of internal monitoring and also expanding the size or number of acres that comprise our wilderness preservation system?
Well, it does involve both of those, but I think it's more. I think the former is really more important. Yes, it's absolutely true that our increasing population is putting more pressure on these places, and I actually say that they're being used to death rather than loved to death. But wilderness at its core, and the philosophy behind the Wilderness Act is about restraint. And we, as a human species, have to be willing to show some restraint, or wilderness can't survive. And that doesn't just mean restraint in terms of not, going in and logging these places for timber or mining them for minerals or drilling them for oil and gas. It also means restraint in our recreational use of them. And that's one of the big challenges we face today, because as you point out, it's not just the increasing population as a country as a whole, but a lot of these communities that are near a lot of our wildernesses are growing faster than the population at large. They're attractive places to live. People are moving there, and there are not only more and more people wanting to go there, but more and more people wanting to do more and more different kinds of things. So there's no question that these places are under increasing pressures from recreation use and population growth alone, and managing that is important. And at the same time, more and more research is coming out almost daily, certainly weekly and monthly, showing the impacts of recreation on wildlife. And it's not just motorized recreation, which we have always pointed the finger at. It's our hiking, our horseback riding, our presence in the backcountry is consumptive in the sense that we are consuming space. And there are a lot of wildlife that flee, that avoid trails, avoid humans. So when we're out there, we're actually displacing these critters. And that's a hell of a conundrum for those of us who love wilderness and love to experience it, and people should experience it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that that's having impacts. And so we see more and more demands, and we see bills like the American Outdoor Heritage Act and these kinds of bills that Congress has been debating, and they tout them because they call them conservation because they're promoting more access. But in reality, that access is the opposite of conservation. It's use. And it's putting the wild critters who really have nowhere else to go at increasing stress and displacing them in these places. So recreation use is a huge challenge for wilderness managers, and it's a huge challenge for us as individuals to acknowledge the impacts that we have and figure out how are we going to preserve these places and at the same time have opportunities to visit. But we have to recognize that human visitation is impacting these places.
That's very well said. Being a little more specific, I have believed for decades, following others, that nothing kills a wilderness area faster than a road. But I am coming to see that our modern system of trails spreading throughout wild places has become a major problem. What should and can be done about it?
Well, you're right about that. Obviously, roads are anathema to wilderness, but our trail systems also have an impact. And I think what needs to be done about it is, first of all, we have to acknowledge that issue, and second, we have to put limits on use in places that need limits, and we have to be willing to accept those limits and support those limits as wilderness visitors, as wilderness advocates, et cetera. And it's going to be site-specific, place-specific, but we have to recognize that building more trails into wild country is diminishing that country for the wildlife that lives there. And in some ways it diminishes it for other visitors as well, other wilderness visitors who really appreciate wild places, trailless places, et cetera. But most importantly, it's diminishing it for wildlife. We have to be willing to show restraint. And without that, these wilderness areas won't survive, and they certainly won't survive as really valuable habitat places for wildlife.
Do you think that eventually designated wilderness areas are going to have to include areas that are off limits to human visitation in order to preserve the integrity and beauty of the land?
I mean, I certainly, and we certainly don't reject that idea. And there are wildernesses that are closed to human visitation on some national wildlife refuges, for example, where even the refuges have been closed to human use in order to protect sensitive wildlife. And I think people, frankly, I think people will accept that. I mean, there are user groups that won't. There's no question about it. There are wilderness user groups and wilderness visitors who don't believe in restrictions. But I think most people will. They have to be explained why. But, there's the Forest Service. I don't know that they still do this, but they used to conduct a survey every 5 years. This was a national survey, and they would interview 100,000 people, something like that. So it was just the American public at large. It wasn't focused on wilderness visitors per se, but the American people at large. And they would ask them if they were willing to restrict their use, constrain their use for different reasons. And it would consistently show something like 95% of people said they were willing to restrict their use, show restraint, if it would benefit wildlife. Mm-hmm. So I think in a general sense, people would be willing to do that. But it requires the land management agencies having the courage to step up and talk about it and put those kinds of restrictions in place. And unfortunately, we kind of live in a system where managers are graded by how much they can produce, whether it's board feet of timber, whether it's animal unit months of livestock grazing, or barrels of oil, or recreation visitor days. And they're not measured and judged by how well they protect the land. So that's part of the challenge. And like I said, I'll keep harping on it. Mm-hmm. We as visitors, we as wilderness advocates have to advocate for limits where they're necessary, and we have to support those limits. Mm-hmm. But I think that the whole idea of having areas, allowing areas that are really set aside for nature, set aside for wildlife, is something that definitely deserves discussion and support.
Okay, one more question on this. What about going off trail? Is this an individual choice, or should there be a policy about it?
Again, it's probably site specific, but I think it's an individual choice. But it is a conundrum. I mean, that's the hell of it. It's hard in some areas to truly get a wilderness experience on the trail because there's so many people, because the trails are so highly developed that you don't feel like you almost feel like the wilderness is on both sides of you, but you're actually on a trail that isn't part of it. They're just too developed, too heavily used. And so I understand why people want to get off trail. And the experience changes a lot. I've been with a lot of people in wilderness who, when you do go off trail, get very nervous. They feel like as long as they're on that trail, that human constructed thing, that there's somehow it mitigates the danger, the risk. It mitigates the adventure. I know that.
Yeah.
And so the feeling when you're off trail is different, and we certainly wouldn't want to see some sort of blanket prohibition on that sort of on going off trail, because again, that is part of the epitome of a wilderness experience. And in some places, I've been in the Arctic Refuge, for example, but it's true on a lot of BLM administered wildernesses. There aren't trails. It's just route finding, and that's great. That's what wilderness should be about. But at the same time, we have to recognize the impacts that we're having when we go off trail, and that's where limits on the number of people, limits on the amount of use have to come into play.
Okay. It's a tough issue. I agree.
It sure is.
Yeah.
It is.
And that's why I wanted to ask you about both of those issues, because I'm ambivalent about them myself. But anyhow, regarding the constant threats of mining, grazing, logging, water projects, inholdings, airplane noise, etc., within our wilderness preservation, I agree with your organization that the 1964 Wilderness Act should be the guide in defining and determining wilderness. Explicitly, the idea is that wilderness is a place untrampled by humans, a place that retains its primeval appearance, where human activities are substantially unnoticeable, and where human visitors do not remain. So, for 30 years, some have been advocating for a peopled wilderness or an indigenous wilderness, where some kinds of human activities are integrated into the wilderness. What do you say about such a wilderness ideal?
Well, I think that the wilderness idea that we have that is fundamental to the Wilderness Act, which is there should be some places where humans aren't trying to be in charge, where humans aren't intervening, places where, if you will, the Wilderness Act is kind of nature's Bill of Rights. I think that is absolutely the right thing we should do. Endorse it 100%. And in fact, there are Native American tribes who have wilderness areas patterned very much on the very same concept. And just north of where I sit here in Missoula, Montana, the Salish Kootenai tribe has their Mission Mountains tribal wilderness, which is managed even more restrictively in some ways than the National Forest wilderness that's on the other side of the mountain, the Mission Mountains wilderness that is part of the wilderness system. So I don't think it's a concept that is unique, that does not mesh with indigenous people or native people's beliefs. There are lots of native people who are very supportive of wilderness. So I don't think that those two things are in conflict. There's certainly a lot of land. The wilderness system makes up about 3% of the lands in the lower 48, leaving 97% of the lands available for other approaches. But I think the wilderness system itself is, and I think the people, all the people, regardless of race, color, creed, etc., are best served by having places where we as humans step back and let nature be. And so I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, but I think our wilderness system needs to remain as it is.
Okay. Do you think of North America as a big wilderness before the arrival of Columbus? And why do you think that some individuals are so keen to argue that North America before Columbus was not a big wilderness because it was managed or civilized by Indians, especially using fire? Do you see a hidden motivation or political agenda in such a perspective?
Well, for some, I think there is, but I'll say this: there's a lot of dispute out there in the research community, the scientific community, et cetera, about how much impact Native Americans had on these systems. Certainly, there were Native Americans here when Columbus got here. It wasn't an unpeopled continent. and they were having impacts. There's no question about that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the large, the giant mammals and large mammals that existed were extirpated or eliminated by humans long before Columbus arrived on the continent. So there was an impact, but look, even the places where they were inhabiting were probably as wild as a lot of our wildernesses are today. The numbers were far fewer. They didn't have the machinery, the technology, everything else that we have today, having all these impacts. And so I think there's so much of our areas that are wilderness today that were probably the least influenced by humans prior to 1492. The Native Americans settled, lived in, spent most of their time in the same place that the Euro-Americans wound up in, because those are the most productive habitats. Mm-hmm. Those are the most livable places. That's, they weren't spending, all their time on the top of peaks in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. Mm-hmm. They were living in the Bitterroot Valley, same place that the Euro-Americans colonized. So I think that the suggestion that somehow there wasn't what we call today wilderness in North America when Euro-Americans arrived is nonsense. Of course, there was. Now, there's the saying that I hear it from whites. I haven't necessarily heard it from Native Americans, but that they didn't have a word for wilderness, and it wasn't wilderness; it was home. I get that. I understand that. There are a lot of people, Glenn, and I'm talking now about Euro-American people who have been in a place for a few generations, and when you talk to them about designating a nearby place as wilderness, they say, that's not wilderness. We've been going there forever. Mm-hmm. We've been using that place. We've been doing all this stuff. That's not wilderness. Their idea of wilderness is somewhere they've never been, somewhere that they perceive as more wild or remote than their backyard, while others of us look at their backyard and call it wilderness. So these are just, sort of gradients of attitudes about these mm-hmm. places. But we have a wilderness system, and it's defined what it is. And it's says that these places will be untrammeled by humans, and it's not a backward-looking idea. It's a forward-looking idea. Of course, all of these places have had, at some level, influence from human beings for at least the last 10,000 years and maybe longer. And the idea is that going forward, we're going to allow them to sort of determine their own evolutionary destiny. And we're not going to intentionally try to interfere in what happens in these places. So it's not a suggestion that anywhere might not have been influenced by humans in the past. There are wildernesses in the East, for example, that probably were cut over 2 or 3 times by Euro-Americans, let alone what Native Americans might have done in the thousands of years they lived there. But now that they're wilderness, we let them be. And so again, it's an issue that'll be debated for a long time, but in some ways it just isn't relevant to our wilderness system because our wilderness system doesn't suggest influence or absence of influence in these places prior to designation. It just talks about how they'll be administered going forward. Mm-hmm. And if you really want to look at it in the long-term perspective, North America was unpeopled for eons, mm-hmm. for millions of years before the first humans arrived on the continent. So in big long-term picture, North America has been unpeopled for 100 times as long as it's been peopled. So that the idea that we would have some places that humans weren't controlling is not a novel idea or a novel situation out there on the ground. Mm-hmm. That was the default for millions of years. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I can go on and on and on about that, but ultimately, again, it's an academic argument, and there are academics literally out there who love to challenge the idea of wilderness because they claim that it's somehow anti-indigenous or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think those are credible arguments.
Okay, well, I thank you for the comments. I know it's a very complicated issue, but I wanted to hear what you had to say about it. So shifting gears, following the 1964 Wilderness Act, Wilderness Watch, stress that the purpose of wilderness is to preserve, quote, wilderness character, consisting of both tangible physical components as well as intangible psychological and spiritual components. Now, clearly, grazing in wilderness area diminishes and degrades wilderness character. Without getting into legal details, did I understand you correctly that federal land management agencies already have the authority to formally determine that an area is no longer chiefly valuable for grazing, and that they may therefore permanently retire the lease on this area?
The short answer is yes, they can, but it is a little bit more complicated because the Wilderness Act, yes, it states that the purpose of the act is to preserve each area's wilderness character, and that's the fundamental mandate for wilderness managers. But it also included some exceptions and what they call special provisions. And one of those special provisions says that livestock grazing shall be allowed to continue where it was occurring at the time an area was designated as wilderness. So certainly the founders of the Wilderness Act and the early versions of the Wilderness Bill that they drafted did not include exceptions for grazing. It phased grazing out. But ultimately, as it went through the sausage grinder of legislation, it kept that special provision. So managers can't say, well, this is a wilderness, so we're going to end grazing here. But they are required to administer grazing the way they would on other public lands, and they have to look at what all of the relevant values are. And if those other values, be they watershed values, fisheries values, wildlife values, even recreation values, should the conflicts between grazing and those other things dictate that they eliminate grazing, they can do so in wilderness, and they should do so. And so, yes, they do have the authority to end grazing on a specific place in wilderness. They just can't say, well, because it's designated wilderness, solely on that alone, we're going to end grazing. Mm-hmm. And that's unfortunate, and that's one of the things that, frankly, needs to be revisited by Congress, is the direction for livestock grazing in these places, because there really is. I mean, recreation, in some places, recreation is probably having as big or more of an impact than livestock are, frankly. But in most wildernesses that have grazing in them, and that's in roughly 10 million acres of wilderness around the country, livestock are far and away the biggest impact, and they influence the ecology of these places significantly.
Mm-hmm. So would you also give the same short answer of yes with regard to inholdings in the wilderness areas? Do these federal agencies, in your opinion, have the authority to exchange the land, these inholdings, for land outside of the wilderness boundaries?
Absolutely, they have the authority, and in some areas they actually have the authority to simply condemn the lands in some of the eastern wildernesses, but not in the West. But they do have the authority to exchange, and they should be pursuing those kinds of exchanges or outright purchases. The one thing is involves, if you have an inholding and an inholder is requesting access to that inholding, and it's access that's more than foot or horseback, like all of us have access in a wilderness. But if they're looking for special access, they want to build a road in or whatever, and it happens, and we're in court right now over a situation like that. One of the things that the Wilderness Act says is that the Land Management Agency, as one of their options, can offer an exchange, and if the landowner refuses the exchange, then the agency has done everything it has to do in order to provide access. So at that point, the landowner can access their private parcel by foot or horseback or whatever, but they can't insist on having a road to it.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting.
That's only right.
Mm-hmm.
You
I
think
agree.
about it. If you go out and buy a piece of land that's surrounded by somebody else's land, and when you buy it, you don't have a legal right of access.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're SOL, right? You're not going to get access to your property, and so why should it be any different if your land is surrounded by the public's land? Why should you be able to diminish and degrade the public's land in order to get access to yours? It just doesn't make any sense. And so it's a big issue.
Yeah.
This issue of access is a big issue, but that's what the law says.
Okay. Very interesting. You and your organization make a powerful case that, quote, special provisions, and we've been talking about a few of them, in wilderness legislation are greatly harming wilderness values. You point out that, especially since 1980, special provisions are expanding grazing and access to private land within wilderness, as well as expanding snowmobiling, motorized vehicles, commercial outfitting, excessive hunting, etc. Is this because all four federal agencies, the Forest Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the National Park Service, are failing to meet their stewardship responsibilities, that you are now calling for a national wilderness service that will actually function to administer and safeguard America's wilderness preservation system?
So let's break those down. They're really sort of two different things. So the special provisions that are increasingly showing up in wilderness legislation, those are on Congress, not the agencies. And it's unfortunate, but many members of Congress, they want to pass a wilderness bill because that's a popular thing to do, but at the same time they don't want to say no to anybody. So they put all these special provisions. So as new areas come into the wilderness system, they come in under a different set of rules than what the Wilderness Act prescribes. And so it not only diminishes the wilderness character of those places, but it begins to erode the wilderness system as a whole. People begin to expect that if they can do something in one place, they should be able to do it in another. Managers who oftentimes don't really understand wilderness, don't understand the law, think that, well, when I was managing this area over here, we allowed this, that, and the other. I should be allowing it in these other places. And the public begins to lose perspective on what wilderness means when they see all these sort of non-conforming things in it. So, but that's on Congress, and frankly, some of it's on the conservation community itself, which agrees to a lot of these exceptions and special provisions so that they can sort of count coup and say, hey, we got another wilderness bill passed, hallelujah, when in fact those wilderness bills are diminishing the system itself. I use the analogy often of we keep building, making the system bigger, and it's like we're building a bigger and bigger building, but every time we do it, we're eroding the foundation that's holding that building up, and eventually the building will crash. And the wilderness system is undergoing some of that because of these special provisions. Now, as for our calling for an agency to creating an agency to administer the wilderness system, the wilderness system makes up roughly 1/5 of all of our public lands. And when the wilderness bill was being debated, it was opposed by all of the federal agencies. They didn't want it because they didn't like the fact that it would limit their discretion, that the Wilderness Act was going to tell them how to administer these areas, and it wasn't going to give them the choice about whether or not they were going to protect wilderness values or not in their day-to-day administration, et cetera. And they all opposed it, and it wasn't until President Kennedy appointed Stuart Udall as Secretary of Interior and the former governor of Minnesota, Orville Freeman, as Secretary of Agriculture, and Freeman was a big fan of the boundary waters. So they suddenly had wilderness champions and supporters leading these government departments who said, no, we're going to get in line. We're going to support the wilderness bill, and they did, and the wilderness bill passed. So, but it didn't ever change the culture in these agencies. And frankly, all of our federal agency, the management culture in those agencies is very utilitarian focused. BLM is euphemistically called the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, based on its history. It's not a wilderness agency. It never has been. The Forest Service has never really been a wilderness agency. All of these agencies have had people in them, and still do, who are big wilderness advocates. I won't take that away from them at all. But the agencies at their core are focused on management, if you will. Finding ways to withdraw utilitarian value out of these places. The Fish and Wildlife Service, they like to manipulate habitats to benefit inside refuges to benefit individual species. They don't like the idea of wilderness because it says, no, you allow nature to do its own thing and you accept what comes from that. No, they want to manage it to maximize ducks or maximize bighorn sheep or maximize some other preferred species. And so in all the agencies, what we would consider a wilderness culture has never really taken root. And Glenn, back in around the late 1990s, the 4 federal agencies commissioned the Pinchot Institute for Conservation to look at their wilderness programs and, kind of look at them and say, well, it's been 25 years since the Wilderness Act passed or 35 years at that point. How are we doing? And the the Institute's report, and they commissioned they pulled together a bunch of wilderness experts from around the country to sit on this panel and make recommendations. And basically what the panel said is if the agencies don't change their ways, the wilderness system will be lost. And I can guarantee you that since then, it's only gotten worse, substantially worse. And that was before Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the Doge effort began to lay off so many of what was left of the wilderness program in these agencies. We lost a lot of wilderness rangers and others in the firings and the massive layoffs that occurred. But it was happening already. The wilderness programs in these agencies were significantly diminished, and that's especially true in the Forest Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service have never had much in the way of actual wilderness programs, even though they administer a huge amount of the wilderness system.
Okay, could I stop you there for a minute?
Yeah.
Because I'm on question 14, and I have 38 questions. We only have about 18 minutes to go. So let me just say, hence the need, based on everything that you just said, hence the need for a wilderness agency or National Wilderness Service. And
Absolutely.
Okay, and as my question then about this is, as you and your organization conceives this, would and should this wilderness agency have the power to close cherry stem roads and to implement a mandatory end to cows within our wilderness within our wilderness areas, and to undertake a mandatory buyout with just financial compensation for inholdings within the wilderness boundaries?
Well, ultimately, it would depend upon what authorities Congress would give to this wilderness service.
I see.
I don't think we haven't really addressed those kinds of specifics in our proposal. It's more a matter of creating an agency that is constructed of people who have wilderness as their core value and as their core responsibility, versus the current agencies where they have their responsibilities are timber and mining and grazing and all these things, and wilderness is kind of a secondary or tertiary duty or responsibility, and so what they could do. We're not talking about changing the Wilderness Act per se. It's just changing who is it that is overseeing the way that these areas are administered.
Okay. So wilderness, as understood by the 1964 Wilderness Act, is a high standard of land and water protection. Why do you think so many environmentalists shy away from embracing big, holistic wilderness?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of them still embrace and advocate for, and some don't. I think part of it is the issues we were talking about earlier, where there's this perception out there among some people that somehow the idea of wilderness is anti-indigenous. And so for some groups that becomes somewhere they fear to tread, I guess. Maybe it's because other issues, be they climate change or other things, have risen in the public's mind. And so you see a lot of mission creep in organizations because of where the funding may be or the public interest might be, and they drift away from their core values, or they drift away from their original missions. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it's probably better to ask them. why they've lost their
Mm-hmm.
enthusiasm for wilderness. We certainly haven't, and we certainly won't. And so, yeah, I don't know what else to tell you about that.
Okay. In my mind, the goal of, quote, small victories, which seems to be very popular these days among a number of environmental groups, in my mind, this makes little sense in the age of the sixth extinction. And I agree with you and Wilderness Watch, and I take this is a quote, that there is no hope of preserving wilderness by simply resisting here and there the particular projects that would destroy it. So my question is, what is the big plan of Wilderness Watch? How big do you think America's wilderness preservation system should be?
Well, I would say it should be as big as the American public are willing to set aside places that we're going to allow nature to be. You know, my own personal opinion is I would like there to be lots more wilderness than there is. And Wilderness Watch as an organization, of course, has supported a lot of wilderness bills that have been introduced. But the point is, if in the process of expanding the system we don't preserve its integrity, then we shouldn't be expanding the system, because we'll lose what we have. If we can preserve the integrity of that system, then the bigger, the better. I think the longer picture is, and that's part of where our idea of a national wilderness agency comes in, is that that's the kind of thing we have to do if we want to hang on to the wilderness system that we've got. Because under the current scenario, we're watching the steady degradation and diminishment of that system. And so we can keep playing whack-a-mole and trying to stop every bad project that's proposed. But that's a losing thing in the end. Somebody once described it as it's like we're playing hockey, but all we have are goalies. We don't have any, offensemen who are going down and trying to score. We're just trying to beat back the other team. And eventually the puck gets through now and then, and you lose. And so we need to do things that change the status quo so that we're not in a defensive position all the time. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, we are doing things that benefit these areas rather than just trying to fight off threats all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think some of those bigger picture things are things like establishing a national wilderness, agency that will actually be true caretakers of these places.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, we've got major issues that are way beyond wilderness, be they climate change, be they many other things in the country and in the world. Our consumptive our population numbers, our consumption levels, all these other things that ultimately may make it impossible to preserve wilderness in the long run. Wilderness Watch isn't going to take on those issues. We can't. Yeah. We've got more than our hands full. But collectively, as a society, as an environmental movement, et cetera, we do have to look at those kinds of issues for sure.
Okay. All right. I couldn't find a critique of capitalism with its limitless, expanding materialist economy on your website. I may have missed it. Now, granting the need for the things that you do mention on the website, like writing letters to the editor, pressuring agency people and politicians, attending meetings on public lands, and the like, do you acknowledge the need for an entire new economic model of human survival and progress?
Well, I'll say this. I think that the current system that is pinned on ever expanding consumption, ever expanding population growth, ever expanding materialism and the like is not compatible with preserving wilderness forever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just no question about that. How we remake an economy, how we remake a way of living that is more compatible, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you, I'll say this: if you go back and look through the writings of the people who advocated for wilderness and the wilderness idea all along, they weren't just talking about wilderness. I mean, they saw wilderness in the Wilderness Act as the expression of an ideal, but they talked all the time about the need for restraint and the need to view ourselves differently on this planet. You know, Aldo Leopold talked about us as just plain members of the ecosystem, and Howard Zahniser talked about recognizing our dependence and our interdependence on everything else and all the other species. There's always been an underpinning of the Wilderness Act that says we need to reevaluate our place in the ecosystem, our place on the planet, and I think that's all part of. Okay. Ultimately, it's some of the lessons that maybe wilderness can teach us. One of the values of it and this whole notion of restraint all flow into this idea of we have to reshape the way that we interact with the rest of the world.
So what do you say to those who are fighting for social justice and equality, and perhaps for environmental sustainability and the end of climate warming, but who do not see wilderness preservation and expansion as a key issue of our time?
Well, I would say keep up the fight, of course, but I do think that certainly environmental protection and wilderness preservation are part of that. If we're going to talk about equality and the like, we should also think about equality for other species on the planet. It's not all about us. We're not the only thing here, and all those other critters and all of nature has a right to exist, and so we ought to expand our vision of equality to include other species, not just us. And wilderness is every bit a part of that, and that's what it does.
Mm-hmm. Let's agree that biophilia, or an innate love for wild nature, exists in humans. Nevertheless, a sophisticated propaganda manipulates and controls the population in harmful ways. Is education, in your mind, still the general answer to the crisis of the modern age?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have a really strong opinion about that. I think that obviously education is important. Mm-hmm. Not going to diminish that a bit, but I don't know that education is enough. And education, awareness without action is pretty shallow. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. I think we're just such a distracted culture and distracted society, and focus so much on materialism and consumerism that there's something more profound than even education that we need to be thinking about, and I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Me either. Do you think that ecotourism, in which more and more people are turning to the natural world in search of fun, relaxation, peace, beauty, is making things overall better or worse? It seems to me that on the one hand, ecotourism is raising our awareness of the values of nature, but on the other hand, it is reducing wildness and wilderness everywhere.
Well, I think that connection with nature and experience in nature and wild places is a good thing, and I think that makes us better people. But at the same time, it has an impact on those very things that we care about. And ultimately, Glenn, it comes down to numbers, I think. And again, it gets to this point of with an ever-expanding population, and increasing demands for those kinds of outdoor experiences, it means less and less space for nature. And so it's a good thing, but is it too much of a good thing? And I think that our numbers dictate that somehow we have to figure out how to have those connections with nature, how to kind of generate those are caring for these places and caring for nature without overwhelming it. And that's a tough nut to crack.
Yes.
When there's 8 billion of us and counting.
Right. Aldo Leopold said, "There are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot." This is a frightening statement to me. How do you process the fact that so many people are just not very interested in big wilderness? Would you say that it is only a small minority who crave vast, untrammeled wilderness at this point in history?
I think that's a fair judgment, that it probably is a relatively small minority. Although Leopold also added that respect for minorities would dictate that we do preserve some of these places. I would take it another step and say it's a respect and consideration for all the other species. It doesn't matter so much that not everybody craves a wilderness experience or to be out there. But again, I think most people do have, as you referred to biophilia, most people do have some concern for wildlife and other species. And it's their needs that need to be met by having a large, intact, and wilderness system. So, obviously a lot of people exist without feeling a need for wilderness, but I think they recognize the values that wilderness provides for other things. It provides clean water, it provides clean air, it's a buffer against climate change, it's home for so many species that need it. And I think people can wrap their arms around that, even if they themselves don't really feel compelled to go there.
We're running out of time, but I always ask guests 2 questions, so I have to get these 2 questions in. 1, how do you account for your own love of wilderness? Is it rooted in childhood?
Yes, it is. Very much so. I didn't have big W wilderness around where I grew up. There is some now. It's been designated since. Sort of grew up in the southeastern part of Utah. And I was probably 18, 19 years old before I stepped foot in a place that was actually designated wilderness. But the idea of it felt like wilderness to me as a kid, going out and playing on lands that are administered by BLM right out my back door. it felt like wilderness, and I just fell in love with wild places and in the Book Cliffs and other places around my home. So I think that's to me, I think that's what it's rooted in.
And two, this will have to be my final question, what do you find in wilderness that you cannot find anywhere else?
I think it's just that it's a feeling when I'm in a place that is not human, that is not controlled by humans. To me, it's just wild nature. It's the world as it was for millions of years, and you're just again, I guess you're just a plain member. You're just one of the things out there, and it just feels fresh, and it feels authentic, and yeah, I just love it. It's hard to express in words.
I agree, but I like to ask that question anyhow. So
yeah.
Thank you, George, for deepening my knowledge about America's wilderness preservation system.
Hey, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email at wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org.